Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, Benjamin Netanyahu takes Washington.
I want to thank you for giving me the profound honor of addressing this great city.
And the reception is ranging from a red carpet to a red line. The Israeli Prime Minister's wartime visit coincides with U.S. political turmoil. How is the U.S. election shaping his welcome? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. The Take was in Washington, D.C. during Netanyahu's visit for his joint address to Congress and the protests against it.
When I first came, I was crying to see this many people here, people protesting. It's taken decades, but people finally understand what's going on in Palestine, especially now with the genocide going on.
Netanyahu is losing support across the United States. Most Americans don't want to be part of this genocide, and you can easily see that this is one of the largest rejections of a foreign official coming to the United States.
I would describe him as a vile human being with no consciousness, no understanding of history, no understanding of Judaism and the values of humans. He, to me, is the epitome of the opposite of what I believe as a Jew, how I was born, and he is carrying out yet another genocide.
You guys can see the amount of police that they bring here. They even brought NYPD here. We shouldn't be doing this for a war criminal. We should not be welcoming a war criminal into our country, and we shouldn't expect the U.S. taxpayer to keep paying for this.
The protests in Washington are absolutely crucial. They are the moral awakening of America, in a way.
Today, I'm speaking to someone who laid the backdrop for Wednesday's address to Congress and the protests.
My name is Omar Baddar. I'm a Palestinian-American political analyst based in Washington, D.C.
Omar, it is really good to have you back on The Take. Let's talk about this trip, which all started with the Republican Speaker of the House inviting Benjamin Netanyahu to address Congress, which is an honor that is typically reserved for close allies. But this visit's schedule has been all over the place. Biden's White House meeting was postponed due to his COVID recovery, and Vice President Kamala Harris, breaking tradition, chose not to preside over Netanyahu's speech. Are these just scheduling conflicts, or is there more to it?
I think there is probably more to it. If it was a priority for Kamala Harris to be there, she can rearrange her schedule to be there. There is a contrast between Kamala Harris and Biden on this. It is too soon to say whether this is going to be a contrast in policy. That is an unknown. But there's certainly a contrast in appreciation for the magnitude of Israel's crimes in Gaza, that when Biden speaks about it, he speaks about it extremely casually. It's all the canned responses of Israel has the right to defend itself and we support what Israel's doing and all of that, with kind of very little regard for Palestinian life. And when he does address Palestinian life, you can tell it's not sincere and it's kind of forced. And when you listen to Kamala Harris speak, it's obvious that she appreciates, whether for genuine, deeply human reasons, or whether it's just about understanding the political sentiment in this country, speaks about it very, very differently, understands the magnitude of it. And I'm sure that Netanyahu, being the Israeli leader that so many in the Democratic Party leadership have already said, including Chuck Schumer, the leader in the Senate, have said he should have no place in running Israel and should not be part of Israel's future. To be in a position where you're sitting behind him and having to choose whether you stand up and clap every time he says something, obviously the visuals of that can be really damning, especially in an American climate and a global climate that is increasingly aware of the just unspeakable crimes that Israel is committing under the leadership of Netanyahu, and the fact that he is wanted by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. I mean, So I suspect that there is an effort to not publicly appear with him, but it is still too soon to talk about whether that is an indication of a major change in policy or not.
Yeah. The idea of the clapping every time he says something that happens in the chamber of Congress, it's why we saw several Democratic lawmakers pledge not to be there for the speech. But this is also just a tumultuous time in general in U.S. politics. Of course, just days after President Biden announced he won't seek re-election, which paved the way for Kamala Harris. And as you mentioned, Biden's approach to Israel's war on Gaza has faced heavy criticism, but reports suggest that Harris has been pushing for a more sympathetic stance on Palestine. You said it's too soon to tell, but I know that you're plugged in with activist circles and people who are pushing for a more just policy. What do they believe a Harris presidency could do to shift the U.S. policy, if at all?
Yeah. Look, I think there is an opportunity here. It's one of those cases where it's fair to say that nobody expects a very significant change. It would be ideal in a perfect world for an American president to take over and say, Israel is an apartheid regime, and as long as it maintains an apartheid rule over Palestinians of illegal occupation and violence and human rights abuses and land theft, there's not going to be another penny of U.S. money being spent in support of that state, and not an ounce of diplomatic protection and support. That's the morally correct position. Is Harris going to take it that far? It's practically impossible. But subtle changes, you don't need a drastic change. Sometimes subtle changes can make a significant difference in the lives of people. If all Harris does is put her foot down about the ceasefire and its necessity, and saying that enough is enough and apply the needed pressure to bring it about, that can mean the difference between life and death for literally thousands of Palestinians. But I would not downplay the significance of minor differences. And I think right now there are signs that there could be minor differences that could in fact have a major impact of inching us in the right direction. And that could be really meaningful.
On the other side of the aisle, things are much less complicated. Netanyahu will be meeting former president and Republican nominee Donald Trump on Friday. And his speech before Congress was at the invitation of Republicans, specifically Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, who threatened Democratic lawmakers with arrest if they disrupted it. What does the warm reception that he's getting from Republicans say to you?
Yeah, it's one of those moments right now where Republicans clearly see Israel as a potential wedge issue to squeeze Democrats. They think that they can garner, the American Jewish community is overwhelmingly progressive and liberal, and they overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party. And for some reason, the leadership on the Republican side believes that if they position themselves as more pro-Israel than the Democrats, that means they're going to be able to peel off a part of the Jewish community to have them vote Republican. And that has been what their entire campaign has been about. And there's an obvious answer to that, is that being supportive, frankly, not just of the American Jewish community, but even of Israel, does not have to translate into support for Netanyahu's fanatical government. And yet, what the Democrats have done is, instead of challenge what Republicans are claiming is what it means to be supportive of the American Jewish community, they have caved. They can always be counted on to not have a backbone on this issue. And so you have the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, in one moment saying that Netanyahu should have no place in Israel's future, and then in the next breath, putting his name on that letter from Mike Johnson and extending that same invitation to Netanyahu to come and speak before Congress. But from the Republican perspective, absolutely. They see this as an issue. They can sense Democrats' discomfort with it. They know that every time they say the Democrats don't care about Israel as much as we do, that Democrats can be counted on to clamor to prove that they are supportive of Israel. We've seen it with Biden withholding some weapons from Israel, and then the second there's any fuss about it, sends a ton of those weapons immediately over to Israel. That's the dynamic, and they're putting the Democrats in an uncomfortable position, and they see that electorally working in their favor.
So how might the war in Gaza affect the U.S. election? That's after the break. Omar, I want to talk about what Netanyahu gets out of this, because We've heard from protesters here in the U.S. about their opposition to Netanyahu's visit, but he is also facing massive pressure at home with growing calls for him to secure a ceasefire with Hamas. What does this trip do for him when it comes to what he's facing back home?
So for Netanyahu, I think there is kind of two motivations. One is it's about his personal legacy, and he's desperate. Legacy and kind of like staying out of prison too, for that matter. And what he desperately needs is for this war to go on for much longer, potentially until a President Trump is in office and he can pull a victory out of a situation in which there is no victory for Netanyahu at this moment. He set unrealistic goals for this campaign in Gaza, said they were going to defeat Hamas, said it would take a long time, but everybody understood a long time being like, a couple of months or something. But instead, he's in the 10th month of this onslaught, in which Israel has not held back at all, has just carpet bombed Gaza, destroyed the overwhelming majority of the structure, displaced practically the entire population of Gaza as homeless. I mean, you're talking about over 2 million people in the Gaza Strip, not enough water, not enough anything. And this was supposed to place so much pressure that Hamas would certainly surrender by now. Turns out Hamas was militarily very prepared for this scenario, and they have not been squeezed into oblivion or a surrender. And that presents a really significant political challenge for Netanyahu, who promised a victory that he can't achieve. The same with the hostages. He insisted that the hostages had to be released through military force, that the goal of this mission is to go and defeat Hamas, rescue the hostages, and go. And here we are, with Israel having killed infinitely more of its own hostages in Gaza than they have rescued. The prospect of getting them out without a ceasefire deal also does not seem particularly high. And he knows that if he puts an end to this war and actually agrees to a permanent ceasefire and exchange of hostages, that the day of reckoning comes quickly soon after. The whole promise he had with the Israeli people is effectively give me the authority to brutalize and suppress and suffocate Palestinians, and what I will give you in exchange is security. And it turns out his approach did not provide Israelis with security and led to even greater Israeli isolation in the international community. And so part of it is he's hoping to buy time in Washington to prolong this war long enough in the hopes that maybe President Trump comes in and does something even worse than what we've seen before. There is a regional dynamic beyond Palestine that makes Israel extremely uncomfortable. And the only way that Israel is going to have a regional military victory out of this is to get the US invested and to drag it along into a regional war, potentially with Lebanon, and even worse, potentially with Iran. The consequences of a war of that scale could literally cost the lives of millions of people. The question is Trump unhinged enough to actually go along with a plan of that kind? And again, it's a terrifying prospect, but the answer to that remains to be seen.
Wow. Well, Omar, that brings me to my next question. Hinging on that remains to be seen. There's a significant population here in the United States who are making their voices heard that they do not want that scenario. They do not want this current U.S. involvement in what's taking place in the war on Gaza. These protests in D.C. that we're seeing, they're not isolated. They've been happening across the U.S. for 10 months. Many Biden voters are outraged at his handling of the Gaza war, with some vowing not to vote for him or Harris again.
If she's in the same family as what they're dealing with, then we're back to square one. We haven't really made any difference.
So then you would be voting uncommitted again?
Uncommitted again, absolutely.
I will be voting independent. I can't, in good conscience, vote for any Democratic nominee right now, knowing that they allowed this genocide to happen, knowing that they have sent billions of dollars in arms and bombs to kill and murder Palestinian children, my family. So I cannot vote. I will not vote for a Republican, and I will not be voting for a Democrat.
And critics argue this could hand the presidency back to Trump, who also was pretty problematic, to put it lightly, for Palestinians and Muslim Americans. How do you navigate that debate?
This, Malika, I think is the most difficult question that I've been grappling with, that I've been talking to people who are also grappling with it. On the one hand, historically, I've always been a lesser of two evils voter. out of the principle of reducing harm. I generally don't believe in symbolic morality. The idea that you can just be pure by abstaining from voting for bad people, and therefore, like, if the outcome of you maintaining your personal purity is causing more suffering in the world, I don't think that's a moral choice. Now, that internal calculus for me has been really challenged in this particular case, because if genocide is not a line, then what is? Biden is literally responsible for the killing of people that I personally know, of the family members of people who I consider to be friends. And there is a visceral aspect of it, of how do you walk into a voting booth and click the button of the name of the guy who was responsible for something that is just so utterly devastating, so off the charts in terms of its monstrosity and immorality, while also being perfectly aware of the fact that between him and Trump is in fact still worse. That is an incredibly difficult choice, and it's not an easy one at all. And I think Harris is in a position where she's aware that she has to do more to re-earn the trust of people who would otherwise not vote for the Democrats if they did not change course on this issue, while also needing to remain loyal to the party and to the administration that she's currently serving. She can't have a completely independent foreign policy from the existing president at a time when he's still president. I've heard from people who said that Republicans are a lost cause. They'll never be better on this issue. That's going to take an eternity. But if we punish the Democrats in this election and make sure they lose, they will learn their lesson, and next time they'll be better on this issue. I found that convincing when you could attribute a Democratic Party loss specifically to Gaza, which was in fact the case until Biden's cognitive deterioration was on full display during the debate. And then that changed the calculus, because now if the Democrats lose, they might not think the lesson is we have to be better on Palestine. They might just think, oops, we put up a really old candidate, and right now it's like mixing things up a little bit too late. And is it because Kamala Harris is a woman, or is it because she's a woman of color, or is it whatever? We've diffused the reason for why Democrats might lose in a way that I no longer have the confidence that a Democratic defeat would teach them a lesson about Israel and Palestine. But I'm desperately hopeful that Harris makes an effort to signal that she would bring a significant enough, I'm not expecting a complete change in the direction that I would prefer policy to be, but at least significant enough to make this a bit of an easier choice.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Ashish Malhotra, Khaled Soltan, and Sonia Bhagat, with Veronique Eshaya, Tamara Khandaker, Manahil Naveed, Doha Mus'ad, Mohammad Zain Shafi Khan, and me, Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Wazwaz. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.